I was having one of those late night discussions, you know, the sorts that you have about what's the core of Adventism? What theology comes in the core of the Adventist belief system? And we were discussing the 2,300 days, and we were discussing vegetarianism and the health message, and a list of some of the distinctives of Adventism. But when you're challenged about what's the core of Adventism and you begin to debate it, it can become quite technical. Which is the most important theology? And where does faith sit in terms of our unique beliefs? How do we relate to faith? Is it at our core? Is it part of who we are? So today I thought it would be useful to take us through a story that shows examples of how faith relates to different individuals, and to ask that question, what is at the core for each of the characters in today's story? So if you have a Bible with you, I'd like you to open to 2 Kings chapter 5. And today we're going to walk through this story asking the question, what is at the core for each of the individuals in this story? 2 Kings chapter 5, starting at verse 1. Now Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram, and he was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram, and he was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. So here's the story. Israel is again at war with one of their neighbours. And as I'm sure I've talked about on a number of occasions, the neighbours tended not to be very pleasant. The neighbours were the sorts that stole their babies and ate them for lunch, literally. That would come and rampage the land and stop the Israelites from being able to even plant crops. And so the Arams, if that's how you pronounce it, had been this kind of neighbour, and there'd been difficulty and of course they'd won victory, and that's very difficult for Israel. And this man Naaman, who was the commander of the army who had been engaged in these acts, was a man who had leprosy, a very disgusting and disfiguring disease. He was a strong man. He was respected by many men. He was fearless and proud and able to have all those qualities that a person would have to be able to take a fierce army into war. And yet now sin had taken its toll on Naaman, and he was disfigured by a very debilitating disease. I once preached this story in Tahiti, of course, where they speak French, and so everything you do has to be translated. And the lady who often translated for me was a beautiful lady named Sylvia. So if you can imagine, she was tall with long blonde hair, and so when she stood to translate beside me, she was quite a tall lady. And I'm doing the devotional for a women's thing, a retreat of some sort, a leadership training, and I'm saying, you know, leprosy is a disfiguring disease and it takes your nose away. And I hear, you know, Jojo, 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 Michael Jackson. And so literally I went like this. And she went, you know, like Michael Jackson's nose. And I'm like, right. Not quite sure that's what I was trying to say. But nonetheless, you've got to trust the translator, right? You give out your words to the translator and they take them and they give them. And so in preparation for this sermon today, I thought, you know, I don't want to be doing the Michael Jackson thing. I need to make sure I know how leprosy disfigures. So I get on Google, as all good preachers do, and I'm Googling images of leprosy. And I have to say, it isn't great. Wouldn't recommend Googling at home. It's like the worst form of eczema you have ever seen in your entire life. It's these huge, big, bauble-y things on people's faces. And I saw pictures of what I thought leprosy was like, which was where fingers have come off. So they've got no sensation in their fingers, and so they touch things and damage their hands, and you don't even realise that you've done it. And so, all little cut off stubby fingers. But as I'm going through the image, guess who appears? Michael Jackson. And so I was quite perplexed. Did my friends in Tahiti know something that I didn't know? So I confess that this is all Google, right? So I Googled, did Michael Jackson have leprosy? And apparently there's a school of thought that suggested that he did have leprosy, because a number of the characteristics that he displayed are actually symptoms of leprosy. So he often had bandages on his hands, or he covered his hands over. He had discoloured patches on his face. He had no hair at the end of his life. He was on a cocktail of medication. And interestingly enough, apparently the reason that leprosy does damage to your nose is because it actually eats away at the cartilage in your nose, and your nose collapses and squashes into your face. Not a medical person. I am just offering you a Google version of events. Please don't hold me to this, but this is what it said on Google. And that there was all that funniness about Michael Jackson's nose, and that it had actually started to collapse. And so this article that I read even had an explanation of how Michael Jackson may have got leprosy, because my understanding is it's actually quite a difficult disease to get. You have to be exposed to it quite a lot to actually get leprosy. So you need a cut, or you need your immune system to be lowered. So apparently, I didn't know, but Michael Jackson went to Africa in 1974. And so some theorise that Michael Jackson got leprosy whilst in Africa in 1974. And so then people argue, well, none of the other Jacksons got leprosy in Africa in 1974. And so the other theory is that Michael Jackson had a monkey. I'd forgotten that. Don't even know whether that's true either. And that you can actually get leprosy from 3 animals, one of which is monkeys. And so that maybe Michael Jackson got leprosy from a monkey. Whether this is true or not, I'm not sure. But what is true is that it's a disfiguring disease. And if Michael Jackson was struggling with leprosy, then he was struggling with a disease that, whilst can be cured in today's society, still does significant damage. So imagine that you're Naaman. You are this man whose strength, whose power, whose leadership has dominated other nations. And now you've got a disfiguring, weakening disease that nobody seems to be able to fix. Let's see what happens in verse 3. 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 3. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him the talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." When Elisha, the man of God, heard the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. It's obvious that Naaman has tried every method in his country to make him healed. Because here he has the situation where a little girl says, "If only my master would see the prophet." I grew up with this story, from Sabbath school class. And Sabbath school class told me that the little girl evangelised Naaman. So when I began reading this story as an adult, which happens for me a lot, having grown up in Sabbath school, I started reading, and I don't actually see an evangelist there. I don't see her, offering a program or doing any witnessing. In fact, she just says, "If only my master would see the prophet." As I was first researching this passage, I was ironically on a plane coming back from Disneyland. Well, to be fair, I had been in America for some sort of training event, and because I was working in New Zealand and cared for French Polynesia and New Caledonia, they didn't have lesson pamphlets for the children's Sabbath school in French. And so I had convinced my boss that I had to go to the Inter-American division in Florida, right near Miami Beach, and nothing else other than a Disney World, to convince them that they needed to partner with the New Zealand Pacific Union to send them lesson pamphlets. And so that's what happened. I went to the training event, and then I got on a plane, and I only had 24 hours there because I really was going to get lesson pamphlets for French Polynesia, and so I couldn't, have 3 weeks there. But I went to the Inter-American division, and I discovered that the problem was that they were Spanish-speaking people who didn't speak much English, talking to me who spoke English, trying to get French lesson pamphlets to New Caledonia. So that was kind of the problem of why all my emails hadn't really gone anywhere, because the ladies who were receiving my emails spoke Spanish. And when I arrived, I was kind of like oh, look at that lady, look at her, kind of a bit of a, some sort of excitement, yes. And so they ran upstairs and found somebody who spoke English. That's not the story I'm going with, but that just to give you the context. I did do work, I promise. And then I went to Disney World and to Miami Beach, but that's another story too, because that's kind of a bit of a strange place. But I went to Disney World, and Disney World is an amazing place. It has just the ability to transport you into another world. And it was Walt Disney's goal to make a place where everyone had fun, that mums and dads and grandmas and grandpas and aunts and uncles and sisters and brothers and little people and big people were all enjoying a space. And I have to say, even though I was there by myself, I was caught up in the magic, that you were transported to a whole different world. And I got on the plane having done my 2 tasks, one seeing Disney World and the other getting my lesson pamphlets, with that sense of joy. And I'd printed out all of this research about this passage to read on the 14-hour flight. And as I'm reading, I picked up the sheet where I'd printed out the story in the NASB, the New American Standard Bible. Now, we're all aware, right, the Bibles are translated in different ways. So the King James Version is a literal translation where they take the Greek or the Hebrew and they say, that's the Greek word, what's the English word? So it's absolutely very literal. An NIV and New Living Translation and, all of those sorts of translations are thought translations. So what they do is they take the Greek sentence like that and they say, how do we best get the intention of that thought into English in the best possible way? So I always like to have a little read of a literal translation just to get any sense of if there's any differences. And I always like to read a number of translations because I don't want to rely on one method of translation because they're theologians and they debate about this stuff. Right. So I'm reading away and I read the New American Standard Bible, a literal translation, and it says, "She said to her mistress, I wish my master would see the prophet." I wish. That's a whole different tone from an evangelistic campaign, isn't it? If only, I wish. That's a little girl whose core is faith, whose heart says, oh, I feel compassion for this poor man who is suffering from leprosy. Keeping in mind that this is a little girl who has been stolen from her family and from her country by a group of warriors on horses and camels and armies in the middle of a fight. Yet somehow she has developed a sense of compassion that when she sees her boss in a difficult situation, her heart leaps with compassion and faith and says, I wish, if only he could see my prophet, if only he knew my God, I wish that he could see my God. It's a whole different perspective from her trying to tell him of her God. It's a little girl filled with faith. And when I can only imagine that what was at Naaman's core was despair and discouragement, the little girl held the hope. She held the faith deep in her heart that if Naaman could get to the prophet, then he could be well and that he could be healed. Except, of course, no one follows a child's instructions. We don't necessarily believe children sometimes when they speaking from that place of wonder and that place of joy and excitement and imagination, from their ability to walk into Disneyland and suspend disbelief and know it's not real, but to enjoy the magic just for a moment. Because we adults, we have to be kind of enticed into it, don't we? It's pretend. No one lives happily ever after. We know the logic about that. We like to live in this world of scientific determinism and logic and rationalism and consequences and all these kind of adult logics. So we get to Disneyland, right, we're going to have a good day with the children, aren't we? Right. And we have to be enticed into it. Because the children just go, yeah, I know it's not real, but let's pretend. Let's have fun. Where's Pooh Bear? Let's go. And their energy and their play and their ability to have faith is inspiring. It kind of entices us adults in. But we don't always necessarily listen to them because, well, they're just children and they do all that imagination and that play stuff and that wishing. So Naaman goes and asks permission of his king, of whether he can go and see the king of the opposition, of the army they've been at war at. And he says, sure, I'll write you a letter. And they go off to the king. And the king sees the leader of the army who has caused him so much difficulty, and his core immediately is seen. He acts as a man whose heart is filled with fear. What are you doing here? What do you expect of me? I can't possibly be able to cure you. What do you think you're doing? And he starts doing his sackcloth and ashes and he's tearing his clothes. He isn't behaving like a leader. He isn't behaving like a man who stands firm on the understanding that God has rescued them in the past and that God will rescue them in the future. He's frightened. His core is filled with fear, and we see his behaviour represent that. Are you trying to pick a quarrel with me? What are you trying to do? And of course, it's then that Elisha hears what's going on. And he says, send the man to me. The child knew what to do. The child knew where Naaman needed to go, even if the king did not. Even if the adults could not follow the instructions of their children. Verse 10. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, so he comes to Naaman's house in verse 9, and Elisha doesn't come out, verse 10. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord of his God, wave his hands over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a younger man. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, "Now I know that there is no God in the world except Israel. Please accept now a gift from your servant." And the prophet answered, "As surely as the Lord lives, whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." And even though Naaman urged him, he refused. "If you will not," said Naaman, "please let me, your servant, be given as much earth as a pair of mules can carry, for your servant will never again make burnt offerings and sacrifices to any other god but the Lord." So Naaman finally gets to the prophet Elisha. And here Naaman he's got an expectation. You remember, Naaman would have been as close to royalty as you could get without being royalty in his own land. So he's important. He's used to an entourage. He's used to people taking him seriously. And so a message gets sent out to him. How rude is this? It's like Naaman has planned his own salvation and healing. Irvin Jensen says this leprous dying man had actually the presumption to devise in his own mind exactly the plan by which he wanted his cure to be effected. You want me to read it again? The leprous dying man had actually the presumption to devise in his own mind exactly the plan by which he wanted his cure to be effected. Naaman thinks he knows best. Naaman's got it all worked out. He's an organiser in his heart, is Naaman. He knows how it should go. He's a man of the world. He's got it sorted. He knows just how things should be. I can't be too hard on Naaman, because I do wonder from time to time if I might not be a bit like that. Dear God, I've got this situation, and look, I'm thinking that what you need to do is this. Could you just solve my situation? And here's A, B, C and D. I would recommend to you, God, that you go with option A. I think that's the best way to solve my situation. But if you can't consider A, could you do B? Or preferably C? Or there's D. Planning our own salvation? Planning how we think God gets to solve the situation? I wonder sometimes if Naaman wasn't trying to be in control. And I wonder if at our core sometimes we aren't trying to keep all our world sorted. We're trying to control it. We're trying to hold on to it. And we come to God not with a heart or a core of faith, but with a core of control. And we have a conversation with God about how we're sorting our world out. But at the end, sometimes we're trying to tell God how to effect our own cure. Naaman thinks he knows better. He assumes that Elisha should have showed him the respect of his position and what he deserves. And so he says, "The rivers in my town are better than that disgusting, ugly river. How could that river make me clean?" And he walks away. Yet interestingly, it's his servant who seems to have some faith. and has a discussion with his boss and says, "Sir, I've seen you do the miraculous. I've seen you do the amazing. I've seen you fight as hard as you can fight. I've seen you climb mountains, face huge armies. If this guy had asked you for money, if he'd asked you for some sort of war effort, if he'd asked you for something big, you would have done it. But he's asking for the simplest thing, which sometimes is actually the hardest thing. To, in faith, go and do this simple act, to wash in the river." I'm feeling for Naaman here because I get it. The simple acts are hard, aren't they? Well, stick with me for a second. Have you ever been in an argument with someone? And you know with all your heart that this situation would be solved if you would just reach out and say, "I'm sorry." Simple thing to do, right? But I'm wondering if anybody else has had this experience, because I suspect it's not just me. But those words get stuck in your throat. And there's those self-righteous moments where you just go, "Why should I? Oh, I don't want to. Do you know what they've done? You know what they've done." But you know that if you would only step out and reach out and say, "I'm sorry, how do we fix this? I'm sorry that you're hurting," even if we're not apologising for what we've actually done or what's been said, even if it's not our fault, but to reach out that hand of reconciliation. That's a simple act, right? Why is it that simple things can be so very difficult? He's willing to pay a great price. He's willing to go an amazing distance, and he is willing to do a great deed. But the simple act of faith to wash, that requires letting go of ego, of pride, of control, and coming to that place of faith, coming to that place of hope. And Naaman, talked round by a servant girl and a servant of his army, goes and washes in the River Jordan. I've got the name of the river wrong. It's the one in Damascus, isn't it? He goes and washes in the river. And he washes and washes 7 times, and he comes back out, and he is like a child again. There's some beautiful imagery in that, isn't there? Because this would have been a man who was sunburnt, who had been outside a number of times, who had lots of scars from fighting. I can see him in my mind, whether this is true or not. Maybe this is, creative imagination on the Bible here. But, they would have fought with swords. I can see, lines on his face and his arms where the swords have gone in. And he goes into that river, which he was thinking at first was a bit yucky and dirty, and it makes him as clean again as a baby. Beautiful, soft, white, unscarred skin. His act of faith has made him new again. And Naaman finds a treasure that is so important that you can't buy. He finds the treasure of faith, of wonder, and of wishes. Faith was what got Abraham and Sarah through barrenness. It was faith that gave Moses the strength to lead when he thought he wasn't capable. It was faith that helped Rahab find a new profession, a new nation, and a new family. Faith is an amazing treasure. It's the belief that God, who has made the world, will in fact bless us and lead us. It's hard to do sometimes because faith doesn't necessarily change our circumstances. It doesn't necessarily make everything perfect and better. But it does carry us through. And it does acknowledge that God is good and that he is leading no matter our circumstances. So when Jesus was asked to explain faith, he took a little child and he brought them out and he said, this is what faith looks like. Their ability to trust and to love and to wish and to wonder and to imagine and to believe. It's that core that's an amazing treasure that Jesus said that we need. We can have all the other treasures in the world. We can be the leaders of army. We can be the leaders of nations. But how do we build this most important treasure in our hearts? To have faith. I love Naaman's response to what God did for him. I love that he took the soil back to his land and said, from now on I will worship no other God but this one. It's a beautiful response. How do we respond? Do we remember all of the things that God has done for us in the past? Do we trust him to keep leading in our world and in our lives till the day comes where he takes us home and takes us to a place where there will be no more death or mourning or sorrow or tears, for the old order of things has been promised to be passed away? Do we believe in that? I remember working in New Zealand, and the office there was in Manukau, which is the highest crime district in New Zealand. And our office was right on the back of a road that was filled with housing commission houses. And we'd had some very difficult situations where somebody had actually come over the fence into the nursing home, because bizarrely our office was in the middle of a nursing home and, little old people's village. Somebody come over the fence, nearly beat a man to death in his home for his computer. That was the sort of district we were living in. And I used to look out the window every day and see dreadful things. The police would be up the street 3 times a week, the RSPCA, and I would drive down the street regularly and there would be children as young as 2 running around on the street in nappies, no shoes on, supervised by other children of nearly primary school age. And I look at that situation and I say, with all my heart, I want to fix that. I want to make it better, because small children with wonder and wishes and hope shouldn't be exposed to trauma, neglect and abuse. It destroys their hearts and their core. But what could I do? Except to hold on to my faith that one day God was going to make all things new. That if he couldn't fix it here right now, if there wasn't something that I could do this very day, that one day God would. And I believe with all my heart that maybe that's the treasure we need at our core. Yes, it's great to understand the 2,300 days. Yes, it's good to have a healthy lifestyle. But let's not put that at our core. Let's put the treasure of faith at our core and hang all of those other beautiful and interesting and unique theologies that Adventism offers us around this one important thing. That I can believe this very day that God is good, that he's at work in my life and he's at work in the lives of children in difficult situations. He's at work in difficult situations that each of us face today. And to hold on to this treasure at our very core and let everything else build on the knowledge that God is good and we can put our faith in him.